The next presentation is going to be an assessment of oyster fitness relative to freshwater inputs. This is given by Darren Rumbold from the University of Florida Gulf Coast University. Let's move to the next slide. The purpose of this presentation is to present the findings of a recently completed study on the effects of prolonged low salinity on the Eastern oyster in short intervals of high salinity to recover. Information from this study could assist resource managers to maximize the discharge volume without undermining the sustainability of oyster reef in the area. This relates to the fish and wildlife and habitat protection priority areas. And I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Rumbold and all his colleagues on this project. Please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Ernst. And I also want to thank Jennifer and Nicole for the invitation to present this information. A number of you are familiar with the project. We've been doing it for a number of years, actually. What we would like to do I need to recognize my co-PIs, Swani Valetti and Eining Lowe, who most of you probably remember were at FGCU before they moved up to UNCW and Elon. And then Rebecca and Sam were the graduate students working on this project. They did the lion's share of the work. Next slide. So I think most of us on this group understands the problem. Obviously, the watersheds both over here and St. Lucie have been extended artificially by connection, and we're dealing with those flows from those extended watersheds. Next slide. And of course, those flows are related or can cause lower salinity in the estuary, dilute the estuary quite a bit. Here you can see some relationships between a number of sites in the Caloosahatchee, 2 flows at S79. And occasionally those flows are high enough to actually overwhelm the tidal forcing, and a site can be kept at 0 even though you have flood tides coming in. It overwhelms that tidal forcing. Next slide. So oysters, and we are going to be talking about oyster today, as opposed to some of the other valued ecosystem components in the estuaries. But oysters are important for a number of reasons, but they're also osmoconformers, and so they will have diluted hemolymph under low salinity conditions. And if it gets too low, they can have problem in terms of maintenance. Next slide. So we have lost oysters in the Caloosahatchee estuary. There's some early reports where navigation was difficult in the Caloosahatchee because of the oyster reefs. But here you can see that going up estuary further than Shell Point, you start to encounter more and more dead oysters up to the Cape Coral Bridge and so forth. We also lost, if you go to the next slide, we've also lost oysters in the St. Lucie estuary quite a bit since 1940. So that's obviously a concern. Next slide. And so I'm sure everyone on this call is very familiar with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program and the folks that are working on Recover. They're doing an excellent job developing performance measures, trying to identify optimal ranges for various ecosystem components. These are some of the optimal ranges and stressful ranges of salinity for oysters. We modified it a little bit, adding a seasonal component, and particularly related to high temperatures, which we'll talk about quite a bit today because it is a contributing factor. There is, it worsens the effect of low salinity stress. But so again, these folks on SERP are working to develop the optimal ranges that we might be able to maintain in the future when SERP is built out. But until then, we may continue to have some high flows. Next slide. So the high flows may continue, and I'm not going to get into the most recent stuff, the results of the LOSM versus LORS, but we need some more tools. The district may need to have some tools to, even with the benefits of the new conditions and operation schedule, they may need to refine those conditions to possibly hold the line of the existing oyster reefs, or maybe even extend the oyster reefs up estuary. Next slide. So again, we all know also just from being out on the water that oysters are highly resistant to short-term changes, or they wouldn't be able to tolerate being exposed to air at low tide. Some of us have had to ship oysters, and we know how successful even shipping oysters over a couple of days, and sometimes having FedEx lose your cooler, and they actually last quite a few days, and particularly when we cool them down. So again, oysters do tolerate stress for over short-term periods. Next slide. So sometimes it's better to not think about averages, but it's also, it's more important, particularly on the damaging side, it's more important to think about the amount of time, in this case days, below some critical threshold. Again, in the past, we've had instances of very prolonged high flow events, exceeding 100 consecutive days, where the flows out of S79 were greater than 35 parts per thousand, which would cause a good deal of the estuary to be fresh throughout the diurnal cycle. And it's that long-term high flows past a few days. As we'll see today, oysters begin dying rather quickly, and you may end up having about 100% mortality after about 14 to 21 days, depending on temperature. So it's these long duration high flow events are the biggest concern that we have, because after a while, with the valves closed, the oysters cannot exchange gases, and their anaerobic end products start to build up, and they can actually, they will end up suffer mortality. Next slide. So again, several years ago, Peter During and Patty and we got together, and we were talking about the possibility of, well, could we pulse the high flows? Could the oysters survive and grow during prolonged exposure below its critical low salinity threshold if given repeated short intervals at higher salinity to recover? So this focus on the recovery period is really what differentiates this study from previous studies that looked at the low salinity threshold to determine when the mortality was going to occur. We want to see if we can keep them maintain survival based on these recovery periods. Next slide. So overall, it's a tool for the water managers to allow them to discharge as much water as they can without undermining the sustainability of the reef. And so we want to try to keep the salinity as high or as low as possible and minimize the recovery periods. So we carried out iterative bioassays where we would develop the protocol for the next study based on the results of the previous study, and we did that in consultation with the district. But the idea was to determine the longest duration that oysters could be exposed to some minimum salinity, whether it be 0 or 5 parts per thousand, and then determine the minimum number of days where we would have to jack up the salinity a little bit to allow them to open up and recover before we again brought them back down again to the low salinity, and they would close up. And because we know temperature is an added stressor, we did it at 2 different temperatures, and we did this both for adults and spat. Next slide. So here's one slide diagramming the design for adult oysters. We used only oysters from Florida. All the adult oysters were collected from Estero Bay. We shipped these oysters to UNCW where they were carried out. Each condition had 3 replicates, and the replicate being an individual tank. And then within each tank, we had 10 to 15 adult oysters. And what we would do during each trial, we would have a negative stress control where we held 3 of these tanks at 25 parts per thousand. We would also have a positive stress control where we would lower the salinity to the minimum that we were working on, and we would hold it there at that low salinity for the duration of the experiment. But of course, what we were really interested in is what would happen in terms of survival and condition index and a couple of other parameters I'm not going to talk about today. But what would happen if we dropped the salinity over a 2-day period, kept it at some low stress salinity, and then allowed it to brought it back up again over a couple of days, give them a couple of days of recovery and bring it back down and so forth, at least doing 3 cycles, and determine, as I said, particularly the daily survival of these oysters. So each one of the tests is going to look something like this. Next slide. So we ended up for the adults, and I'm going to talk about the adults first and then the spat. We ended up with 4 different trials over a couple of years where the oysters were exposed to different permutations of low salinity stress. How low did we take the salinity, the duration that we kept them at this low salinity, and then different permutations of how high we had to bring them back up to a recovery salinity and the duration of the recovery period. So this required 27 different experiments, some lasting as long as 70 days. So I'm not going to take you through each one of these. Next slide. But I am going to show you some graphs, and the graphs are all going to look very similar, almost like this, where you have survival on the y-axis, and actually all the positive stress controls that were kept for duration are going to be shown in orange. And then at the bottom, the x-axis is the number of days of the exposure. And so in this case, this was trial 1, where we had 3 days of stress at 0 parts per thousand with 2 days recovery at 10 parts per thousand. And you can see at 18 degrees, when they were exposed to this under 18 degrees Celsius, they survived for a very long time. But at 30 degrees, because it's the higher stress, they died much quicker, and we reached 100% mortality in about 10 to 14 days. Next slide. Oh, wait, back up. I'm sorry. I just want to point out, again, those were the oysters held for duration at these low salinities. They were not given recovery periods, but the other 2 lines representing the gray line and the blue line were, well, the gray line was given recovery at 10 parts per thousand for 2 days, intermingled in that long duration. And then the blue line is the control oysters held at 25 parts per thousand. And that's what, again, you're going to see mostly on all these graphs. All right, next slide. So here are all the graphs for the adults. I'm going to step through a few of these, but you can see right off the bat that we have greater mortalities sooner at higher temperature. Temperature certainly did exacerbate the stress of the low salinity. And again, we went through a number of different permutations through these different trials to find out which ones would be the best. Next slide. So we're going to skip to the results of trial 3 here. And again, we're still talking about adults, and this is at the lower temperature. And so the control was at 0 parts per thousand. That was the positive stress control, but we had relatively good survival after exposing the oysters for 7 days at 0. If we gave them 7 days of recovery at 7 parts per thousand or 10 parts per thousand before we brought them back down again. And this trial went out beyond 60 days. Next slide. But we wanted to go back actually to and look at extending this a little bit further and possibly even reducing the recovery salinity. So trial 2, we had 0 parts per thousand for 3 days, extending it a little bit, and the recovery at 5 parts per thousand salinity or 10 parts per thousand was fairly good. Next slide. But I also want to mention that, and I'll mention this several times, these salinities would be damaging to spat, so we need to keep that in mind. Next slide. So we also again looked at condition index. which is the amount of dry tissue relative to the normalized to the shell cavity, because we didn't want, oysters just hanging on at the very end. So again, condition index is used as a measure of physiological condition. Next slide. And trial 2, where we had fairly good survival, we also saw fairly good condition index when you compared it to the negative stress controls. So they were not just holding on; they were doing fairly well. Next slide. And then even at 30 degrees Celsius, which is an additional stressor, as I've said several times, we had trial 3 and trial 4 where we had fairly good survival if we gave them days, a certain number of days of recovery at a slightly higher salinity, whether it be 7 parts per thousand or 10 parts per thousand. And 7 parts per thousand is actually better for the water managers, because they can actually release more water to achieve 7 than if they wanted to hold it at 10. But trial 4, we actually were able to reduce some of the mortality that we wanted to do by limiting the stress period to 5 days at 0 parts per thousand rather than 7. At 30 degrees, 7 days was just too much. It was dropping it below the 50% survival that we were trying to achieve. So our recommendation in the future will be 5 days at 0 would be the maximum at these high temperatures. Next slide. And at 5 days, if you take a look at not only the survival, but also the condition index, it did not vary as compared to the oysters that were maintained at 25 parts per thousand for that duration. So we were pleased with that as well. Next slide. Well, again, I need to remind you that these salinities would still be damaging to spat, and we're going to move to spat next. Next slide. There we go. So the spat, as you'll see several times, are more sensitive, but we ran the experiments very similar to the adults in terms of maintaining a negative stress control during each trial and holding them at 25 parts per thousand for the duration. We also included a positive stress control, maintaining them at whatever the lowest salinity was for the duration of the trial. And then again, being interested in what would happen if we alternated stress versus recovery for at least 3 of the 3 cycles for the trial. All the spat came from Florida. They weren't triplex spat. They were, most of them in all trials except one, they were collected from the field. In one trial, we couldn't get any spat from the field, so we did go to a commercial hatchery. But again, we were using Florida oysters. And we did, again, have triplicates involved in these beakers rather than aquaria. The water was changed every other day. The oysters were fed a algal paste that is very commonly used in many studies. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about growth. Next slide. So we ended up with, again, 4 different trials with the permutations that I've already discussed. And so we had 31 experiments, some with lasting 91 days. So we were able to maintain survival in some of these spat for 91 days. We needed to extend it out because one of the parameters we were looking at was growth. We thought growth was very important in the spat, almost equally important as survival. Next slide. So this is some of the first data in trial 1, where the stress period was very limited to 2 days. The recovery period was limited to 3 days at 10 parts per thousand. We took them down to 0 parts per thousand and 5 parts per thousand, and they did not do well at 0 parts per thousand. We had 100% survival mortality within 10 to 14 days, depending on the temperature. And so they were more sensitive to the low salinity. Next slide. And so we also tended to focus more on the 30 degrees Celsius, because that's when the spat, some of the peak spawning occur in late summer, and then in the cooler September, October period, but we wanted to be able to maintain or stress them out at the 30 parts per thousand. Next slide. So at 30 parts per thousand, this is trial 3. We had 7 or 10 days at 3 parts per thousand or 5 parts per thousand. We discontinued anything at 0 parts per thousand, but some of the early studies suggested 5 parts per thousand. They did fairly well with 5 parts per thousand. So we went back and looked at 3 parts per thousand as the stress salinity, and we determined that that was not going to work because, again, we had 100% mortality very quickly. There was about 11 or 12 days. And even when you gave them recovery periods, we still had quite a bit of mortality. Next slide. And again, we were also interested in growth. As I mentioned earlier, we were actually surprised by the survival in 5 parts per thousand, even if we held it at 5 parts per thousand for the duration, but we did not see any growth in those exposures, and we wanted to see growth. So we, again, did see growth in exposures where we gave them recovery, and surprisingly, sometimes the growth in those exposed oysters that had recovery, the growth was actually exceeded the growth we saw in the controls. So we thought this might be growth hormesis, where they may be overcompensating a little bit for the stress that they were being exposed to and actually growing a little bit better. Next slide. So at 25 parts per thousand, at 25 degrees Celsius, we had fairly high survival, well above 50% in all the exposures, including, again, the one that was held at 5 parts per thousand for the duration. But of course, they did better if we did give them recovery for a few days, 7 or 14 days at 10 parts per thousand. And as the next slide will show, again, next slide, we did not see growth in the positive stress control held at 5 for the duration, but they did grow fairly well, even better than the control at the negative stress control held at 25 parts per thousand. If we stressed them a little bit at 5 parts per thousand for a few days and then gave them recovery periods. Next slide. So in conclusion, we've got a number of conclusions. First off, obviously, we need to appreciate the temperature under which the low salinities occur, because there is a synergistic effect, and the sensitivities are greater. During the less stressful, cooler months, the adult oysters can tolerate lower salinity for a longer period of time. They can actually survive 0 parts per thousand for up to 7 days if they're allowed to have 3 days of salinity at 5 parts per thousand to recover before repeating that pulse of high flows. But again, that would be harmful to the spat, so we're recommending something different if you want to maintain the survival of the spat and the adults. Next slide. So if the water managers have more flexibility in the amount of time to release the water during the relatively cooler months, we would recommend to maintain survival and growth of the spat, in addition to, of course, the survival of the adults. That inflows should be targeted to produce a local salinity of not less than 5 parts per thousand. So don't take it down to 0, only take it down to 5. Do it for no more than 14 days, and then allow them 14 days or more at 10 parts per thousand to recover before repeating. That would allow them, again, to grow. During the more stressful, hot summer months, the adults, again, can't tolerate the 0 parts per thousand for as long, so we recommend limiting it to only 5 days and then still allowing them time to recover at 10 parts per thousand. But this would also probably result in mortality of spat. So this would be under extreme conditions. And if you, again, have the flexibility, if the managers have the flexibility, you want to have survival and growth of the spat as well, you would target the salinity at greater than 5 parts per thousand for less than 7 days, while allowing them at least 14 days at 10 parts per thousand to recover. Next slide. And obviously there's some bigger picture recommendations in that. The first one being something that's been recommended several times, and that is that because the oysters can tolerate lower salinity more easily at lower temperatures, then we should try to release the fresh water during those cooler months rather than waiting until the late summer to hit them with the fresh water. And but there's some caveats to that. One of those caveats is that we don't want to wash out the oyster spat, and so we've got to discontinue those high flow events late into September, October, so we can at least have a couple of weeks of recruitment of the spat. We don't want to wash them out. You also have to consider that other species might be spawning and having early life stages, and you don't want to wash those life stages out of the estuary as well. And then finally, although it's less of a concern with regard to oysters, then low salinity, high salinity can be a problem. And so we recommend that during droughts and prolonged high salinity, that if the water managers have sufficient water, that they release water and reduce the salinity to 5 to 7 parts per thousand for a week every couple of months, just to reduce the oyster disease, the dermo, and also predation rates in those particular regions of the estuary that we might target. Next slide. So we put this all together in a draft decision tree that we provided them. Of course, more work needs to be done. Next slide. More work needs to be done. We need to determine what regions of the estuaries, the 2 estuaries, to target for these salinities that I've been talking about, because it is region specific. And once that is selected, those regions have been selected, of course, more modeling is going to have to be done by the water managers to determine the flow rates and the return rates to maintain those salinities. And then finally, if we actually do extend the line of oyster reefs up estuary, we may end up having to do some substrate improvements to allow that to occur. So with that, if I don't think I have much time, the next slide is questions, but I also want to advertise that we have a paper coming out reporting the results of 15 years of monitoring in the Crassostrea River. It's in press now, and so that's going to hopefully be very helpful to some people. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much. This doesn't require any action item. So, but then I would like to request, if you have any questions, why don't you send it through the chat, which, by the way, the chat is going pretty good because there's a lot of interactions there. So why don't you ask directly the questions, unless there's a dire one here. No, there's not. So send it to the chat, and then Dr. Rumbold, if you don't mind checking on the chat and then replying there. And that way we will respect the next speaker